By the mid-70s, something else was occurring, and I think it was quite profound. Something was happening that I don't believe has happened ever before in the history of the world, at least not in this particular way. The banks and Wall Street were finally winning what had been, always under capitalism, a long struggle internally, a long struggle between finance and manufacturing capital. There have always been conflicts between finance capital and manufacturing capital. Manufacturing capital invests in labor and things, and finance capital plays with money. The old saying used to go that what was good for General Motors is good for the country, but by the early 1980s, the finance division of General Motors was raking in more profits than the car-making division of General Motors. There was the handwriting on the wall for all to see if you were looking. Finance capital, and that means the banks and Wall Street, and they used to be separate, now they are the same. Finance capital was on top of what was still, by far, the most powerful economy in the world. This set in motion an era in which we started to hear about globalization. We heard that the world was going to change and change drastically. And it was all said in a very celebratory sense. All of the news media, all of the corporate media were heralding the new age of globalization, and they were all telling us that this age was inevitable and it was a very, very good thing. And that was the signal that the lords of capital, that is Wall Street, had made a very important and pivotal decision. They had decided that they would dismantle the industrial capacity of the United States piece by piece. That's what they meant by globalization. And they would ship that industrial capacity off to the third world, not at that time to China, because the Chinese government at that time was not amenable to such investments. But they began shipping the industrial capacity off to various places in the global south, Mexico and Philippines and all kinds of places. The finance capitalists, and those are people who make nothing but monetize everything, that is, they turn everything into capital, were seeking to solve the contradiction of diminishing returns on investment by super exploitation of the labor of people overseas in the former third world. They used the International Monetary Fund to coerce unwilling countries to accept the terms of their exploitative investments. And if that didn't work, there was always the option of covert or even overt military pressure from the superpower or from its junior partners in Europe, especially the French, who have always been quite aggressive. Here at home, they started telling Americans that their stagnant wages and unemployment were caused by big government or by the unions or by lazy black people or because the United States workforce needed an upgrade in education. But the real problem was that finance capital's disinvestment in the making of things in the United States was having domestic consequences. They disinvested and people lost their jobs, and those who kept their jobs found that their wages were stagnating. About at this point, you probably are wondering what all this has to do with U.S. lawlessness and with drone assassinations and with America's constant state of war. I am saying that it has everything to do with it, because that is what happens when the empire begins to collapse. And I maintain that this collapse definitively began with the triumph of finance capital over manufacturing capital. We have now been in this brave new world of the hegemony of finance capital for about 30 years. And the lords of capital, those people on Wall Street, have done very well in those 30 years. They now dominate the U.S. economy, and that means they dominate political life, and that's why we are caught in the kind of dead-end conversation that we are now, in which, for the first time in my lifetime, the rulers don't even fix their mouths to present a solution to your problem. They don't even make one up, because this is a mono-political culture, the political culture of finance capital. In the first decade of the 21st century, the people who handle money have gone from raking in only no more than 16% of the corporate profits that were made in this country to going up to 41% in the first 10 years of the 21st century, a 41% share to finance capital. And even after the meltdown of 2008, they are now taking in 30% of the profits that are made by corporations here in the United States. This means that effectively they own the place. However, by temporarily overcoming their contradiction of falling rates of return on investment, that is, by shipping the United States industrial capacity overseas and super-exploiting third world workers, they have deindustrialized the home country of the empire, and that must have consequences. That has, in fact, created a far more serious contradiction for the U.S. imperial system as a whole. You can't shift the center of the making of things, of human production, without shifting power at the same time. The bankers may have imagined that they could do so, that they could ship the factories off to China or to Mexico, but it cannot be done. They made that bargain, and now we face those consequences. The deindustrialization of the United States and of Europe has inevitably empowered the global South, where the manufacturing occurs. And especially it has empowered China, but also India and Brazil and elsewhere in the manufacturing sectors of the formerly third world. Those countries have also amassed capital. They have stores of money. They've amassed it from their positions as the manufacturers of goods, and also some of them are the providers of raw natural resources as well, so that Brazil's development bank portfolio is now bigger than the World Bank. And China holds more than $1 trillion in U.S. debt. Those countries are now, because of this 30-year period, they are now able to make deals with their developing nation partners. Those are deals, the kinds of deals that the United States either cannot make, does not have the capacity to make, or refuses to make. So the United States now does not even compete on many levels of trade with China, does not even bother. China makes good deals. China builds ports and railways for its partners in the developing world so as to facilitate trade. And those railways are there to stay, and the ports are there to stay. And that is why China has surpassed the United States in trade with Africa and even trade with South America right in Washington's own backyard. The United States has all but given up trying to compete. Wall Street isn't really interested in long-term development of the global South. Wall Street makes its money by rigging markets and attacking markets, as it's doing in Europe right now, and by manipulating process. It plays with money. It does not make long-term productive investment. That is not what money capitalists do. The U.S. then is left with one strategic asset in the world. It has one strength, which is unchallenged, and that is its military. The U.S. and its NATO allies account for 70% of all the arms spending on planet Earth. That is their trump card, and that is the card that they are playing. It's now all about force of arms. It's not about soft power. It's just about hard power. That is the guns and the drones and the threats and the bullying. That means there is no room any longer in their policy decisions for the rule of law. And therefore, the rule of law must be discarded. They make their way in the world by the gun now, and the rule of law and the rule of the gun are antithetical. I believe that when we see the world that way, when we look at the United States as not a power that is whose policies and whose national personality is somehow distorted by cowboy bushes and such, by these caricatures that people make of Republicans and then contrast with the more urbane, cosmopolitan, reasonable-sounding Obama. When we understand the actual position that the United States is in, when we realize that it does not, through its eyes, through the eyes of policy planners and war makers, that it does not have any choice but to do as it does, that the world actually makes more sense. You may think it's scarier, but I don't think so. I think it's much more predictable, and that the end of this imperial rage is also something that we can foresee, as long as we understand that it is behaving according to the laws of economics. Iraq, which was seen as such a great mistake that it was the product of, some kind of Texas insanity, actually makes great sense if the imperial planners see what I think they see, what I believe exists. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was not supposed to be limited to Iraq. It was not just to seize Iraq's oil fields, as wealthy and important as they are. That attack, and we know a great deal about it through leaked intelligence, was supposed to begin with the occupation of Iraq, and then project American power, possibly American troops, but certainly American power deep into Central Asia, into the former stands of the Soviet Union. It was part of the planned encirclement of China. Remember, the United States cannot, will not, is not in any position to resist the growth of China, as well as Brazil and other rising powers. It seeks only to interpose itself, to put itself in a position where it can coerce and bully China. It does not necessarily want to bring down the Chinese regime because a host of American companies are only nominally American companies now. They are really Chinese companies which can call upon the United States, because of their headquarters here, to run the international protection racket for them. But U.S. capitalist assets are deeply embedded in China. But the United States, in order to maintain its position, and having only one card to play, must play that military card. And so the United States rolled the dice with Iraq, hoping to interpose itself, to put itself in a position to coerce and bully China by sitting astride trade routes that either exist or are in the planning to integrate China and the European as well as other markets. It rolled the dice, and the Iraqi resistance made those dice go crap. And it was a great humiliation to the United States. It was a catastrophe. And the U.S. got humble again, so humble that the powers that be realized they had to change the face of U.S. imperialism. They had to change the accent and the tone, not the goal, not the objective, because the objective remains the same, because their assessment of their actual position in the world and what they must do remains the same. But they changed the face, and that face became democratic and black with the same objectives. The new face was, of course, Barack Obama. They changed their approach to subverting the rule of law from the Bush approach, which was American unilateralism. We'll do what we want because we've got the guns to do what we want. Clearly, that didn't work in Iraq. They didn't bargain on the resistance. To a new doctrine. And that doctrine, although developed, discussed, promulgated before Barack Obama, is now the Obama doctrine. And that is humanitarian military intervention, responsibility to protect. This doctrine is much more insidious than American unilateralism. It goes to the heart of international law. And international law is centered, as we discussed, on the sovereignty of nations, on those accords and understandings that the United States itself was so instrumental in putting into effect after World War II. It made the sovereignty of nations the centerpiece of international law. Humanitarian military intervention is a dagger at the heart of national sovereignty. It says that the